Awesome. Welcome, everyone. So happy to see so many organizations and so many folks joining in. Oh my God. Thank you all so much. It's Friday. It's such a good day. It's a little cloudy, but the sun is out, so I'm in a good mood. So my name is Vanessa. I'm a community organizer with Nobody Leaves Mid-Hudson. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm gonna get us going into today's 101 presentation. I hope you all are feeling as hyped as I am. And please, if any questions do come up while we're speaking, please feel free to ask them in the chat. We will definitely get back to you on them at the end. So thank you all so much. So public power. Who is public power? What is this? Well, we're a coalition. We're a statewide movement of community and advocacy organizations fighting for a racially, socially, and economically just and environmentally sustainable energy system. So as you can see here on the map, our goals and a little bit of what that vision looks like is we want to have energy that is also healthy, habitable planet for all people because it's a human right. We want to avert the climate crisis by eliminating the use of fossil fuels and transitioning to 100% renewable energy. We want to make sure that power utilities, specifically electricity, heat, and hot water in our homes, are community controlled, safe, affordable, and reliable. We can actually prevent this climate catastrophe and make utilities a human right with energy democracy and public power. So this means taking over our for-profit utilities, power plants, and transmission lines and bringing them under one public, nonprofit, local, and democratic ownership and management. So through democratic public power, we as communities can make decisions on our rates, what kinds of energies we use, and how the money we pay is used to implement long-term solutions to climate change that center the needs and the health of our people, workers, and environment. I'm gonna pass it over to Jean to get us a little going into explaining more of that.
Hi, my name is Jean. I am a member of Sane Energy and I work at We Act, and I am part of the Public Power Coalition. I'm very happy to be here. Unfortunately, I have the responsibility for the really gloomy part of this presentation. I'd like to start by acknowledging that I'm speaking from the homeland of the Lenape people in Manhattan. We are in a period of profound planet-wide ecological crisis. The root cause of this crisis is a voracious, extractive, profit-based economic system that benefits only a few powerful people. We need to replace that economy with an ecological economy, starting by transforming our energy, transportation, and agricultural industries. By now, most people know a lot about global warming, certainly the people on this call. It's caused by the greenhouse effect, and that causes climate change. To review briefly, emissions of carbon from petroleum, coal, and animal farming, and methane emissions from fracked gas have blanketed the Earth, trapping more and more of the sun's heat in our atmosphere, raising average global temperatures and causing chaotic weather conditions. The impacts of rising temperatures on the climate of our planet are severe and wide-ranging. If people would put in the chat some of the things that they have already seen where you live, whether it's blizzards in Texas or no snow in Utah, that would be great. I hope everybody can see the chat. The effects are already numerous and catastrophic. The average annual loss of ice from Greenland and Antarctica in the 2010s was 6 times greater than in the 1990s. Hurricanes have become stronger and are making landfall in more regions over the last 4 decades. Warmer, drier conditions produce extreme fire seasons in places like California, Alaska, and Siberia. Heat waves are deadly now in Japan, Australia, and India. Flooding and drought are destroying agriculture and forests on 6 continents, and massive deforestation has depleted the carbon sinks that could partially mitigate our emissions, and that has exposed us to pandemic pathogens like COVID-19. And we are living through a major extinction event, seeing the Earth's greatest loss of biodiversity recorded since the dinosaurs. These horrors will continue to escalate with more frequent and more severe crop failures, fires, floods, and famines. The clock is ticking. It will get worse. We have only until 2030 to drastically reduce emissions in order to keep global temperature increases within 1.5 degrees Celsius. Every year we delay transforming our extractive fossil fuel-based systems, our planet comes closer to being literally uninhabitable. People are already dying and being forced to migrate as a result of climate change, and the situation will worsen rapidly. How did this happen? Virtually all global economic, energy, and ecology decisions are made by relatively few institutions, commercial, government, and financial, that are controlled by the rich, who make decisions based on what maximizes their short-term profits. Our entire civilization is built on an economic system that requires constant and unlimited growth. But we live on a planet with limited resources, so this makes no sense economically or ecologically. The consequence is that those corporations seek to maximize resource extraction by any means necessary and as cheaply as possible. Sustainability, safety, health, and concern for human needs are merely obstacles to be overcome in a for-profit economy. So when ecologists and climatologists began sounding the alarm, corporate interests responded with a tremendous amount of money to suppress, deny, obfuscate, evade, and downplay the crisis they caused and profit from. The harms of climate change are not equitable. Environmental racism and economic injustice are pervasive and are manifest in the siting of fossil fuel extraction, polluting production, the dumping of toxins into the air and water, and disposal of dangerous waste. Crisis capitalism, greenwashing corporations, and cleanup businesses is popping up everywhere you look. As long as there is something left to make a profit from, investor-owned companies will race to plunder our commons. And the utilities that produce our electricity and thermal energy are among the worst. So just to get a sense of the volume of greenhouse gases that we emit in New York, statewide in 2018, we released 27 million metric tons. Of that, in Orange County, it was 868 tons. New York County, our city, 2.6 million metric tons. Monroe County, 500,000 metric tons. Queens County, 6.5 million metric tons. Rensselaer County, almost 1 million metric tons. And Suffolk County, 3.5 million metric tons. In 2014, in Rochester, about 1.8 tons of CO2 were emitted. And of all of the components of energy use, home energy is the largest culprit in our state, followed by transportation. The transition has already begun. Since the environment will not wait, the question before us is not if things will change, but how they will change. We need to ensure a just transition. And to do that, we need democratic community control of our energy economy instead of a corporate monopoly system with minimal state regulation. Public utilities, which don't need to produce profits for shareholders, will be able to rapidly transition away from fossil fuel energy generation and to clean, renewable energy. However, to make sure it's a fully just transition, we must also guarantee good working conditions and family-sustaining union wages for all energy workers. We need to clean up the toxic sites that were just externalities for those corporations, and we need to provide customers with affordable, progressive rates and protection from shutoffs. Private investor-owned utilities will never do these things. They can't do these things. We have no time to lose. Public power is the solution we need. And I'm going to pass that on to Sarah Hahn.
Thank you, Jean. My name is Sarah Hanna, and I'm a member of the Mid-Hudson Valley DSA. To understand what got us to our problem, let's take a look at how the system is set up. The primary reason we're facing a climate crisis and expensive utility bills is that energy production and distribution have been organized as an extractive, investor-owned, profit-driven industry that is protected by the very government bodies designed to regulate it. So let's start with the basics. What is the grid? The grid refers to the complex network of electricity generation plants, transmission lines, and distribution wires that connect the producers and consumers of electricity. So the US electricity market is divided into three regions: the Western Interconnection, the Eastern Interconnection, and the now notorious Texas Interconnection, also known as ERCOT, or the Electric Reliability Council of Texas. ERCOT is the only interconnection that's not federally regulated since it doesn't cross any state lines. Each interconnection has what are known as balancing authorities. The balancing authorities make sure that power systems demand and supply are balanced. They do this by consolidating the electricity assets in their territories and managing wholesale electricity distribution. Through a tiered system known as the auction, distribution utilities buy electricity in response to demand. They start with the cheapest kilowatts first and move up to expensive electricity when demand is very high. And this expensive electricity comes from what are known as peaker plants. During the recent storm in Texas, customers received bills for thousands of dollars because the ERCOT was buying expensive electrons in a period of extreme demand. But customers of Austin's public utility didn't experience this kind of extortion because as a publicly owned utility, they were not using this auction system. And also, they don't determine what to charge for electricity based on these unexpected shifts in demand and supply. So who decides utility policies, rates, and growth? States regulate electrical utilities through public service commissions known as PSC. Some PSCs are elected, most are appointed. In New York, the governor appoints the commissioners. When a utility wants to raise rates or change policies, it must bring what is called a rate case before the state PSC. Now, various stakeholders can join these rate cases, but they happen to be arcane, time-consuming, and secret. In cases where systems cross state lines, the federal government regulates those through the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, and the members for that one are appointed by the president. So we want to ask members in the audience to post in the chat if you have experienced a prolonged power outage due to extreme weather or other damage, or struggled to afford your utility bill, or been threatened with shutoff, or had an issue with your utility and struggled to reach customer service and find a solution in a timely manner. So what do we mean by investor-owned utilities? We mean for-profit corporate monopolies that run these utilities like Con Edison, National Grid, Central Hudson, and so on. These utilities have historically led the opposition against a just energy transition. They spend fortunes on lobbying to protect their growth and beat back legislation intended to mitigate the climate crisis. And where they are forced to make investments in this transition, they use the rate case system to shift the costs to customers through higher rates, not because they don't have the revenue, because they do, but because they don't want to decrease shareholders' profits to pay for a green transition. And that's what it means to be for profit. First and foremost, the profit must grow. And what are the consequences of these privately owned companies running our utilities? We have high bills and economic and racial injustice. The state PSCs protect the utilities by guaranteeing a return on equity. And this is typically around 10%, which is a percentage calculated against what's called the base rate. Now, the base rate can only be increased by building more infrastructure, meaning companies are financially rewarded for investments that are harmful rather than beneficial to people and the planet. This is known as a perverse incentive. We see this type of expansion of fossil fuel infrastructure happening despite community opposing it. For example, in the case of National Grid's MRI North Brooklyn pipeline. And when utilities drive up base rates to increase profits, who does it disproportionately impact? Of course, families of color and low-income households. Low-income households also pay a larger share of their income on energy, and 50% of all families that spend 10% of their income or more on power bills are Black. Low-income households also can't afford new, more efficient technologies, so they end up spending more energy and therefore paying more for it. Privately owned electricity and gas companies are, of course, notorious for neglecting their infrastructure. They have no incentive to maintain and repair transmission and distribution systems. And in fact, more than 70% of transmission lines and transformers in the US are over 25 years old. Most of us have heard by now that neglect by PG&E is a primary cause of the devastating California wildfires. Neglect, of course, also caused the massive storm blackouts in Texas, which is a state where free markets and cheap prices are prioritized over reliable service. So private companies are just horrible at being climate resilient. They have not acted on any serious plans for it. During the COVID-19 pandemic, they didn't make any plans for relief funds, for example. State governments have had to force these companies to implement moratoria on service shutoffs for out-of-work customers. And even with the moratoria effective in New York State, companies like Orange&Rockland, Central Hudson, and Rochester and Gas Electric continued to send final termination notices that made no mention of the moratoria. Instead, their customer service representatives pushed struggling customers to get on payment plans or apply for HEAP. According to the Department of Public Services, New York residential customers collectively owe over $1 billion in debt to utilities as a result of COVID-induced economic hardship. And while these residents face shutoff through no fault of their own, shareholders of these same utilities have raked millions of dollars in profits. We should learn from Texas. Deregulated investor-owned utilities there willingly chose not to winterize their infrastructure just to save on costs and ensure profits, even though they were warned numerous times of potential storm risk. This caused a deadly and prolonged power outage for nearly 5 million people during a winter storm. These Texas utilities then price gouged these customers who retained electricity and heat in their homes, with some people incurring bills of nearly $5,000 for just 5 days. This can easily happen in New York. It's not just something limited to Texas. In fact, in 2017, negligence from rg&e left tens of thousands of Rochester residents stranded without power in the heart of winter. So I'm now going to pass to Christian to talk about Long Island, but I just want to remind everyone quickly to post any questions that might be coming up for our Q&A section in the Q&A window of your Zoom application. Thank you.
And thank you, Sarahana. Hi, everyone. This is Christian Rouse with Suffolk County DSA. So Long Island can kind of be its own thing sometimes, and its electric governance is a good example. We're actually farther along than everyone else in New York in achieving public power. We already have a public authority that owns most of Long Island's and Rockaway's electric assets, and we have villages with fully municipalized grids. But as I'm about to explain, it's not enough. The Long Island Power Authority, or LIPA as you know it, currently entrusts an investor-owned corporation called the Public Service Electric and Gas Company, PSEG, to operate its assets and carry out its day-to-day management. As a result, all of the issues you've heard about affecting people from across New York State, they affect us too. When Tropical Storm Isaiah struck, Long Island suffered one of its most widespread power outages in modern history. It laid bare PSEG's mismanagement as over 500,000 customers were without power in the middle of August. The customers did their part by reporting the outages using the tools given to them, but they were let down by a communication system that PSEG knew in advance would fail in a crisis. Without that central communication, there were tree trimmers who were left waiting for the power crew to come, shut down the power before they could do operation, and vice versa. So power lines would fall into people's yards, remain live for hours, and people would have to stay inside their homes. Without power, without food, the medications they had in their fridge would spoil. But this campaign is not about just correcting the wrongs that took place last summer. This is about true public power. And that means going deeper than just ending the public-private relationship that continues to fail us. Right now, LIPA has the power to implement interim rate hikes. Normally, rate hikes are only implemented after filing a rate case in public hearings. But LIPA can raise rates on an interim basis and bypass that process entirely. This is an unaccountable public authority, and we need to correct that. LIPA is saddled with debt. Lately, it has sought property tax reassessments for the assets it owns in towns and villages across Long Island. From their point of view, it has been a successful approach. They've been able to prove that the assets were being overassessed and secure settlements that reduce their property taxes. But for the communities that rely on that income to fund their public schools, LIPA is public enemy number one. When it was first created during the 1980s, LIPA was supposed to have an elected board of trustees, but fearing politics, Governor Mario Cuomo insisted on an appointed one. And well, folks, the apple hasn't fallen far from the tree. The governor appoints 5 of the 9 LIPA board members, and one of Andrew Cuomo's appointees is Elkan Abramowitz, the attorney who is now representing him in the nursing home investigation. So would you be surprised if I said that Mr. Abramowitz had no relevant experience in electric policy? So what do we mean by true public power on Long Island? First of all, it involves democratizing not just the LIPA board, but the decision-making process. No more appointing political allies, no more interim rate hikes. Instead, we are pushing for the democratic election of LIPA's board and full participation and veto power in rate decisions. Public power is achieved by building the institutions that are able to hold LIPA accountable to its customers. It means giving rank and file workers the ability to co-determine policy. It develops public-public partnerships with the towns that already operate their electric grid on infrastructure projects and crisis coordination. Long Island is the front line for climate change's impact on New York, and it just so happens that we're also at the front line for the push to statewide public power. Currently, LIPA is reviewing its arrangement with PSEG, and they will have to choose between A, amending its current contract, which includes a raise in PSEG's management fees, or B, municipalization. But no, we're not just going to sit back here and pray for LIPA to do the right thing, and if they do, we call it public power, and we pat ourselves on the back, tweet about it, all that. No. We are going to create public power ourselves, and we're looking to get started. And now I'll pass it off to Emily with Metro Justice. Thank you.
Thanks, Christian. So we know that the investor-owned utilities are not only failing to get us to the renewable energy future we need, they've also led the opposition against renewable energy policies because their profits depend on it. So to protect the planet, we need another way. The transition to cleaner, more affordable energy can't happen without public power. So I want to hear from you. When you hear the term public power and energy democracy, what does it mean to you? What would you want your experience with your utility to look like? So when we talk about public power, it centers around the principles of energy democracy. This means we need to decarbonize our grid, decommodify energy, which is a human right, democratize the political systems that regulate and control energy, and respect indigenous sovereignty and land rights through decolonization. These principles are the foundation of every aspect of our campaign, from which communities we hope to build with, the movement we hope to strengthen, and the legislation we will pass to build public renewables and free us from the shackles of investor-owned utilities. So the state law called the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, or CLCPA, mandates 100% carbon-free electricity by 2040 and net zero emissions by 2050. We have a long way to get there, but to achieve this within the principles of energy democracy, we as a coalition are fighting for the legislation we need, the New York Build Public Renewables Act and the New York Utility Democracy Act. We will achieve public power through passing and implementing these bills. So the New York Build Public Renewables Act addresses the lack of renewable energy, with solar and wind at a mere 6.5% of total electricity generation capacity. So NYPA, the New York Power Authority, is the largest state-owned utility in the country, with a track record of providing the most affordable energy in New York. So it makes sense for NYPA to be the vehicle that drives their transformation by expanding its capacity. So NYPA currently generates 25% of the state's power, which is equivalent to 6.5 gigawatts, of which 75% are hydropower plants. So this bill will enable NYPA to own new renewable generation projects. It will also service low-income communities at a locked-in price and give all New Yorkers the option to purchase 100% renewable electricity directly from NYPA, a public utility, at rates lower than those of investor-owned utilities. The bill does all this while remaining revenue neutral, meaning it will not cost the taxpayers a dime. So this bill also bans energy service companies, or ESCOs, that are meant to serve as middlemen between clean energy generators and distributors, but instead often prey on the elderly and immigrants by locking them into bait and switch contracts with high rates. So this makes renewable energy inaccessible to many. By cutting out the middlemen, we can end these predatory practices and automatically enroll low-income customers in more affordable renewable energy instead. So we also have the New York Utility Democracy Act. So while the NYPA bill does a lot of things, it doesn't address the distribution side of our energy system. It also doesn't bring the democratic governance and public ownership throughout the electricity sector that is needed for New York to achieve 100% renewable, democratically controlled, publicly owned electricity we need. Therefore, this bill will work in concert with the NYUDA bill, and this will require the transition of all New York State's distribution utilities from privately held to public entities within 2 years. This is done by initiating a process of defining and creating new utility territories based on principles of environmental justice, equity, and energy democracy, and sets a timeline for scaling down all gas infrastructure across the state while coordinating and scaling up renewable electricity needed to meet the new demand. This will all be achieved through democratically elected utility boards and a statewide oversight board that will include environmental justice advocates, labor, independent policy and engineering experts, and good governance groups. And so this will ensure that we meet the scale of the challenges for New York's energy system while lowering rates statewide and transitioning rapidly to renewables. So what are the benefits of public power versus investor-owned utility? Well, for one, it's 13% cheaper than, public utilities are 13% cheaper than investor-owned utilities. In New York City alone has the second highest municipal rates in the country and still deals with blackouts almost every year. With our public utilities, by removing the profit motive attached to energy, the money that is currently being extracted from us and given to shareholders can instead be reinvested in resiliency efforts and to build out renewables across the state. So nationally, public utilities have power outages that last about half the duration of private utilities. And as we've seen with these storms over the last few years, we need a more resilient grid. With our publicly owned, democratically controlled public utility, we can make our grid as resilient as we want while scaling up renewable energy. We're also making sure that this is labor-centered from the beginning. We know across New York State, these bills will mean thousands of new jobs. And we as a coalition are committed to ensuring that they are well-paid local union jobs that will build out our renewable sector. So in this time of climate insecurity, only a public utility is going to do the urgent work necessary to build the grid we need, including moving transmission lines underground for better weather resiliency, scaling up our renewables, and ensuring we get the energy system we need to avoid climate chaos. And only by creating a public power system can we lower rates, have a say in our energy system, and bring forward the renewable energy green jobs. So in terms of some examples of public utilities across the US, while we envision an unprecedented level of green transition, worker power, and democratic control and governance, the notion of public and not-for-profit utilities is not a new one. There are public utilities owned by states, countries, and municipalities all over the country. So to highlight a few examples, 91 out of 93 of Nebraska's counties are public utility districts. Nebraska residents enjoy some of the lowest electric rates in the country, with an average kilowatt hour rate 31% below the national average. And within the Omaha Public Power District, they have a 5-year rate freeze for its customers. There are also 47 municipally owned power utilities within New York State. For example, Fairport Electric is a public municipal utility right outside of Rochester, was established in 1901, and it charges about a third of the nearby compared to the Rochester utility, rg&e. And it also gets most of its electricity from renewable clean hydropower. There's also Anaheim Public Utilities in California, which charges rates 25% lower than the state average in California. And they also have an elected board, and 75% of their renewable strategy is to come from solar and wind. There are also electric cooperatives rather than municipally owned public utilities in many rural areas, including New York. So now I'm going to pass it back to Vanessa, who's going to talk about how we're going to win these bills.
Woo! Our favorite question of all time. Now that you've all heard a little bit about, not a little, a lot actually, of why public power is the solution, of course, the biggest question is, how do we win? How do we get public power? And really, it's pretty straightforward. There are two main branches to our path to victory. First, it's working through legislation, and second, it's building the organized people power that we're going to need to pass and implement the legislation and to continue to strengthen a truly democratic energy utility system. So in terms of legislations, we need to win our 2 public power bills. So that means that we need to make sure each bill has a primary sponsor in the New York State Senate and a primary sponsor in the New York State Assembly. We then work with our teams to write bills that fulfill our vision for energy democracy. And as the bills are drafted and edited, we must meet with other legislators to get them to also co-sponsor or commit to a yes vote on both bills. And then we move the bills through the various committees that have jurisdiction over the issue. So for example, the Energy Committee. And then once the bill comes to a vote, we must have lobbied enough support among legislators that the bill passes in both the Senate and the Assembly. So while the legislation is the first step for achieving our goals, that itself is not really where the real work of building our power to win actually happens. To pass our bills and implement public utilities, we also have to build our power within our communities. We must bring together our neighbors, friends, and loved ones to join us or join an organization fighting for public power. With that organization, we must build collectives across the state so that we have the number of people and the amount of interpersonal trust and skills necessary to bring in more people to the fight and to lobby, take actions that put pressure on legislators to support our bills. We might also need to take public action like protests or bill strikes whenever necessary. And we also must organize our communities both to win the bills in the short term and to educate them so that when we become informed participants in governing our own utilities in the years to come. A utility can only truly be by the people and for the people if we're equipped to participate in decisions and we're actively involved. This is going to take ongoing education and mobilization after we win these bills. And we're okay with that because we're more than happy to hold our legislators accountable. So a little bit of our history and some of the highlights and what we're going to be looking forward to really is the struggle that we decide who should control our electric system is honestly not new. It's been going on for over a century, and many of the powerful business associates and lobbying firms from back then that the utilities used to gain power are actually still with us today. In New York State, there were important campaigns in the 70s that sought to put electric power back into the hands of the people. But until recently, there wasn't a major public conversation about taking the electrical grid out of the hands of private utilities altogether. So at first, our own public power campaign was focused largely on New York City And when Con Edison, the powerful private electric utility that runs the grid in New York City, proposed raising its fixed rate charges in 2019, the New York City DSA Eco-Socialist Working Group began a door-to-door campaign to fight those rate hikes. They were not the first to organize around rate hikes by any means. The Utility Justice Campaign that Nobody Leaves Mid-Hudson fought around against Central Hudson Utility was a major inspiration. And as the campaign progressed, the New York City group started making connections with members of the Energy Democracy Alliance, such as Metro Justice, Nobody Leaves, Good Old Lower East Side, We Act, for Environmental Justice, the Alliance for a Green Economy, and DSA chapters across the state, who all wanted to see an electric grid without private utilities. And so in November of 2019, the Public Power New York Coalition was born. When the coronavirus struck, we quickly realized how important it was for us to coordinate, and we were able to mobilize statewide for utility relief as working class New Yorkers lost their jobs and struggled to pay their bills. As a result of the work, the state passed a moratorium on utility shutoffs and is now preparing to make concessions on electric debt that would not have happened without a strong public-facing campaign on electricity justice. So a little bit of what we're currently working on is in the next 6 months, we're gonna fight harder for the 2 pieces of public power legislation and to build broad civic support for public power. The first, New York Build Public Renewables Act, would expand the power of the New York Power Authority to own and sell utility scale renewable generation. And then the second, the New York Utility Democracy Act, will direct the state to seize control of the distribution assets. So the wires that go into our homes and businesses, and initiate a process for creating new public utility boards that are accountable to the public. So how do you all get involved? Well, I'm glad you all asked. Our calls to action: energy democracy in New York and this campaign's success are dependent on a mass movement of working class New Yorkers standing up to the fossil fuel industry and investor-owned utilities. There are a number of ways you can get involved in this fight to build the base that we need to win. The first one is you can join a member organization in your area, or if there isn't one, you can get in touch with our coalition at newyorkpublicpower@gmail.com, and someone will follow up with you. And we're gonna also put it in the chat just so that you can feel free to copy and paste it into your email. And I also just wanna shout out, I know a lot of you have a lot of urgent questions and we wanna answer them all. If you all will please just use the Q&A at the bottom of your screen on Zoom. It should be on the right-hand corner. Please, please, please use it. We don't wanna miss out any of your questions. And after all the conversation in chat, we know that some of the messages can get lost. So we definitely wanna address those questions that are being asked. Going back to the second part of how you can get involved. You can introduce us to other organizations that you're a part of or that you think we should work with so that we can begin a partnership. And then the third is if you are a member of an organization and you want to join the fight to take back the grid, consider having your organization sign on in support of the statewide public power campaign and legislation at publicpowernewyork.org. And we're also going to paste that in the chat just so that you can have it. And our amazing partners and supporters are contributing to this fight in so many ways, including research, strategy, outreach, lobby visits, and developing local public power campaigns. We won't win without having the support of individuals, elected organizations, and communities across the state. So please help us make public power a reality. We're also going to throw a link in the chat right now so that you can fill out a short form to tell your representatives to support public power. And that's in the chat now. We're feeling pumped, aren't we? Yes, I love that, amazing. So I know you're all just waiting to get your answers, your questions answered. So I'm gonna pass it over to Sarah Hanna to get us going into a little Q&A.
Thank you. Okay, so I'm just now looking at the Q&A panel on Zoom. Okay, first question is from Mike. How will we create union jobs when union strength is so limited in the private sector? Who would like to take that one? Mohini?
Sure, I can absolutely get us started with that one. So hi everyone, my name is Mohini Sharma. I am also with Metro Justice, which is based in Rochester, New York, along with Emily. So this is actually a great question because one thing that we've, centered again and again is a commitment to ensuring a just transition for energy workers and making sure that we create good, well-paying union jobs. The first good news is that a transition from a private utility system to a public utility system actually does make unionization a lot easier. So not only will the utility workers that are currently union, stay union, but once they're public workers, there are a lot more regulations around public employers staying neutral when it comes to new union fights. So actually what we're really hoping is that in partnership with a lot of local labor unions across the state, that this will actually lead to more workers being unionized in our current energy economy. And in addition to that, we are currently in the process of reaching out to labor to get their specific input and their expertise on what provisions we can put into both of our public power bills to make sure that we actually deliver on a just transition.
Thank you. Okay, and now we have a question from Avni from Agree. The question is, what kind of investments do utilities make to reap huge returns on capital? And what are the tech upgrades that we actually need to improve our aging grid? Perhaps Jean or Emily want to take this question?
Well, I can take the first part. The way investor-owned utilities are structured and regulated, the only way they can increase the profits that they make is by raising what they call the base rate. And the only way they can, and that's calculated, there's a percentage that's calculated against the so-called base rate. The cost of the actual gas is passed through, the cost of the operations is passed through to the customer. So what they do in order to expand their profit is just build, because they can increase the base rate with more infrastructure. And that's why we're faced with the situation in Brooklyn right now, where National Grid is building a gas pipeline that no one needs, that is already obsolete, and that is being forced through Black and brown lower income neighborhoods in order to increase the profits and not to accomplish the energy requirements of people in those communities.
Yeah, and to answer the second part of that, the tech upgrades, well, with an aging transmission infrastructure, we definitely need to rebuild or replace transmission lines. We have to up the capacity of those lines to account for the electrification that will be going on, transitioning our transport system and our natural gas to electricity requires more capacity. But also we need to figure out how to balance the grid with more renewables that are more variable. We also have to upgrade the transmission system in order to balance renewables and account for some of that variability and make it more flexible and meeting our needs rather than having such a huge baseload capacity that's just on all the time and not utilized well. So that's my answer for that.
Thank you. Okay, the next question is from Ziv. Does public essentially mean tax funded? And maybe, who wants to answer this? Maybe Aaron?
Patrick, I saw you jumping at it. Go for it.
I just wanted to say, so I think that public refers to, first of all, a decision-making structure, first and foremost, that is accountable to the people and that puts people's interest first and does not treat energy like a private commodity. So it refers both to a decision-making structure, but also legal arrangements. And when it comes to how, for example, utility scale renewables would be funded under NYPA, That actually does not entail any use of tax money. NYPA, the New York Power Authority, has one of the highest rated green bond programs in the country. So it's actually a revenue neutral way of scaling up utility scale renewable energy much faster than the private market ever could, certainly under the renewable policy conditions currently operating in New York.
Also want to note, Eric from Food and Water Watch says in the chat that public power means public accountability. Okay. Question from Stacy. If a municipality like a town wants to install solar or geothermal to be independent, how would they cut off from the rest of the national grid?
I can start to answer, unless Erin, you would like to. Well, just like a house, if we imagine it, we install solar panels on our roof and we are basically using the energy that we're generating from our house. A municipality can do the same thing. If they need additional electricity or security of supply, something happens, they can get that electricity from the grid. So you want to ensure that you have some sort of security, but it isn't, I would imagine it to be kind of like a house, and how we install solar and on our rooftops.
Great, thank you.
I'd also just add, the Build Public Renewables Act is only talking about utility scale. And so we are fully supportive of community energy projects. We're fully supportive of all local energy projects and see them as integral towards scaling up and getting all the new renewable energy we need on the grid as fast as possible, whether it's large scale and smaller scale. And so we're not trying to take away from any of this. We actually are very much encouraging of that.
Question from Tina. What does a municipal run grid look like? Christian said in his presentation that several towns, cities in Long Island already have such grids. Does that mean that they run the distribution side of things just like National Grid or Con Ed does? Or are they involved in generation as well? Christian, you can start.
Sure, so I'll just talk about Long Island in particular. So Long Island, there are 3 right now. Freeport and Rockville Center both have their own power plants as well. So they're involved in the generation and in the distribution and in the management, as if it were a department within their village government. They have someone appointed to oversee it. And the other one, the village of Greenport on the North Fork of Long Island, purchased its power from NYPA. So that they're not involved, and I think they might have a very small power plant that's as like a backup. So it can run both ways depending on how the plant handles it. And for a municipal run grid, say at a city level, you could do it the same kind of manner. You can either have a village appointed official, or you can elect someone to run that. It depends on Long Island, for example, you can have village level elections or appointees from the board. I'm sure it could be scaled differently for citywide. I'm sure people in Rochester and New York City in particular have their own ideas for how it would look inside their municipalities, but that's just the picture of it on Long Island.
Mohini.
Yeah, I can add to that a little bit. So that's a really good question because the grid is actually generation, transmission, and distribution, right? And the really great thing about both of our bills, the Build Public Renewables Act and the Utility Democracy Act, is that it creates a way for all 3 of those things to actually be public. Now, the generation and transmission side would be through an expanded, somewhat more democratized New York New York Power Authority, or NYPA. When it comes to the distribution utility aspect, what the Utility Democracy Act will do is actually initiate a roughly 2-year process in which we have, technical, logistical, experts in the energy economy and infrastructure, grassroots community groups like a lot of the members of this coalition, as well as hopefully labor, engage in a process of figuring out what these new public utility districts should look like, in order to uphold, standards of environmental justice, as well as like local and democratic control. So we'll go through a process of figuring out what these districts should look like, and what their board should look like and representation there should look like. So the short answer to your question is we're aiming to bring everything under public control.
And if I could just add something to that as well, and this actually goes to another additional question that I saw from my old friend Mary Finneran. Hey Mary, if you're still there. One of the biggest issues that we're seeing in renewable energy across the state is this issue of siting and this issue of consent. So there is a dynamic across the state where wealthier communities that have the ability to fight projects, projects don't get cited in those communities, whereas communities that don't have the same resources, those are the ones where infrastructure gets cited. And ultimately, we don't want to be operating without the consent of communities across the state. And that's why there are provisions in our bills to establish what are called renewable energy hubs that would sort of serve as one-stop shops in each region of the state that would not only facilitate like real, actual, meaningful public engagement on energy issues, but would also be able to direct people to things like renewable job training and helping them understand what energy programs they're eligible for. If you've tried to do this in any meaningful way, you know that it is very sort of catch as catch can, how you can access this information and some of these programs. This would act as a conduit, essentially, between NYPA and the people.
And just to add a little bit about the siting concern on Long Island, for example, and I'm sure everyone's been talking about with the Biden administration plan for offshore wind in the New York and New Jersey coast, the first project that has been already proposed and is trying to move forward is actually off the South Fork of Long Island. But there's been a longstanding legal fight between the village of East Hampton and residents within it who seek to create their own village because the transmission line from the wind farm back onto land to the substation would run underneath their that area, that neighborhood. So it's an attempt to hold off that project. So, and that is, you wouldn't be surprised, one of the wealthier areas of the Hamptons. So these are things that we're looking to address in our package of legislation. We want to make sure that not only do we achieve energy justice by righting the racism and the classism that's existed pre-existing, but we also want to make sure that we can't let a group of residents shut down a project that would be good for all of us. So that's why these hubs are going to be great for is a good regional discussion of regional, and especially for Long Island, that's something we need to unite and coalesce around an energy strategy going forward to address climate change.
Thank you, Christian. So we have a few questions here about our bill numbers, and I'm going to pass that to Aaron so that we can clarify that.
Yeah, I see in the chat and in the Q&A, there are a lot of questions about bill numbers and whether these bills have been introduced yet. And just want to clarify that these bills have not been introduced yet. They will be become introduced in the next couple of weeks, but the bill numbers listed in the chat are not exactly what the bills are going to be. Those are different iterations of different bills. Assemblymember Carroll will be the assembly sponsor for the Build Public Renewables Act. And so we are still working closely with his office. I saw his name in the chat, but those are not the bill numbers. And so we will of course, everyone who is on this call will receive an email with all of the build numbers and their information as soon as we have them. They're currently in processing right now.
We have a question from Emily about how energy retrofits of existing housing stock would fit into public power infrastructure. And I know that in the Build Renewables Act, we do have some language for NYPA being able to do that. If Aaron, you want to talk a little bit more about that.
I could let someone else go since I just spoke
Okay.
a little bit, if someone else is willing. Otherwise, I'm happy to.
I'll be brief since I know we're coming up on time, but I will say that there are enormous barriers for low-income communities across the state to access energy efficiency retrofits. And it's infuriating because if you look at flow charts of energy through New York State, we waste fully half of the energy in the state. It's really breathtaking, and there are financing mechanisms, for example, that NYPA has access to, and benefits of contracting when you get to economies of scale that make it an ideal partner for getting people not just renewable energy, but the kind of healthy and warm homes that they deserve.
Okay, let's see. I think we're gonna go till 6:15, so I will try to fit a few more questions. How will renewables get scaled up statewide? So maybe I can try to summarize this. Basically, we would be allowing NYPA to expand their capacity for generation by giving them 60 days where they can make the first right of offer and determine if they want to purchase or create a new generation facility. And since they already create the most affordable renewable energy in the state, basically what we're saying is we just want them to make more. I hope that answers that. Okay. Can you discuss the dumping of the stranded assets that IOUs are building like mad onto the ratepayers?
So I can be slightly brief just because there's a slight scenario that's happening on Long Island. As I mentioned with some of the assets. Close to me, East Northport's power plant still is operational. It's a peaker plant, just like I'm sure many of you are familiar with the plants in Astoria. Same deal, basically. That's hardly functioning, but the value is going down and down. So there's already some talk of getting those offline, and I'm sure we definitely want to keep pushing those plants offline because they're old-fashioned coal power plants that we don't need.
I can add a little bit to that. As those, before those power plants and other infrastructure are retired, the companies are continuing to generate and distribute power from them. But those people who have the resources, the credit, the cash and the information to shift to either residential solar or community solar or any other renewable source are going to leave the privately owned utilities, reducing the number of customers of those utilities who then will be paying more to cover the costs that the utility needs to recover by their understanding. So those retiring stranded assets those are just a dead loss. And the companies are going to have to eat it.
I want to say something on that point too. I will say that it was really important in learning more and more about how utilities work and how utilities set the rates that they charge us. Something really important clicked for me when I realized that these are not at all like scientific decisions, they're political decisions. Like the way these assets are valued has very little to do with their their utility, the costs that go into them. I mean, there's a relationship there, but mostly it's what the utilities can get away with. And the question of taking over the distribution assets and how we do that, that does force that question. And it's one that I think we need to have out in the open because, you know, the way things are set up currently, they can really charge customers whatever they get away with.
We have a question from Fred. New York is lucky to be more of a union state than others. So what do the unions representing the existing private utilities workers think of public power? For example, UWA Local 1-2 represents 7,000 employees at Con Ed alone. Does the coalition see winning over these unions, or at least talking to them, as mission critical? And maybe Mohini can answer that.
Yeah, absolutely. So first thing to know is that unions are membership organizations, which means that they elect people to speak for them. So I'm not going to speak directly to what unions have said about that because I think them and their elected representatives should do that. However, what I can say is that so many of the organizations and representatives you're currently seeing on this panel have had long-term relationships organizing with labor, turning out in solidarity with labor. Some are union members, and we are 100% committed to doing everything we can to reach out to not only the unions you mentioned, but unions across New York State that represent utility workers, that are in the building trades, that represent public sector workers, and make sure that we get their input and their guidance and their expertise on making this transition and what labor provisions that we need. So we're currently in the process of doing that, and we're really looking forward to being able to share more about that with you all soon.
I want to add something there because I'll never stop being mad about this. When we talk about the relationships between utilities and labor, the utilities that are run for the benefit of the investors and for private profit have terrible relationships with the unions. And in fact, where I live in New York City, our utility is Con Edison. And I believe it was their 2016 rate case, others may be able to help me out, where they built a strikebreaker fund to break the power of their unions into the rate case. So they're taking money from all of us and using it to sabotage labor power here in New York. And that should infuriate you.
Thanks, Patrick. Question from Dan. How would New York's transmission lines need to be reworked to accommodate an expansion of renewables?
I can answer this one. I think this is a great question, and it's something that NYPA is already starting the process of. They're becoming the kind of transmission super hub for the state and doing a really great job on this. They currently already own 1/3 of the state's backbone transmission infrastructure and operate it. And we know that, as we saw in the slides, the transmission and generation grid across the country are in really bad shape. They've gotten a D+ from the Association of Engineers across nationally. So we need to scale up, and it's either building back to this broken system or scaling up to the renewable system that's coming. And that's why our Build Public Renewables Act is so timely for right now, because as you all may have heard this week, but President Biden has talked about a new infrastructure plan that will be coming down the pipe. And there's plenty of money for building out the renewable energy economy and a renewable energy transmission future potentially in there. And so we need to be able to get NYPA in a position to be the kind of right of first offer, right of first refusal for that. So that's what makes our bill so pressing for this year, and being able to scale up from 1/3 to the 100% transmission line across the state to meet our challenge.
I think that also answers possibly Matt's question about the bill that the Biden admin is trying to get through Congress. So moving on, question from Stacy. Since 47 municipalities in New York already have municipal owned power, how will the bills add to that? Will there be a mandate or requirement? I think that this comes to the utility scale aspect of our bill. And I think that most of the municipalities are not of that scale, but if somebody else wants to add to that.
Only in so much that many of them have a power purchasing agreement already with certain agencies. I think Christian mentioned that Freeport contracts with NYPA already for their energy. And so this would just kind of further make that work going across the state and making sure that it's all 100% renewable across the state.
Are there examples of public power that exist somewhere else in the world? Mohini?
I know as we've built both with the Public Power New York Coalition and actually our local campaign to replace rg&e with a local ratepayer cooperative, we have seen some examples of public power in England and in Germany that we've looked into, some in South America as well. Unfortunately, I can't recall like the specifics of those examples at the moment, but would be happy to look into that and get back to you one-on-one. One of the most interesting conversations we had though, as we were beginning our campaigns, was with two folks who participated in the campaign to municipalize Berlin's utility in Germany. And we learned a lot from that effort. I think that was back in 2013. Their initial, I think, referendum, they didn't actually win, but since then they've continued to organize and continue doing that. It wasn't actually because there wasn't massive public support. There was just a bit of a last minute maneuver by their city council that really impacted voter turnout. So they're still fighting. They're still trying to do that in Berlin. I don't know, Emily, you may know of some public utility systems elsewhere. I think you're the one I've heard about some of them from, but no worries if you can't remember.
Yeah, I mean, there are some that exist. And I guess the main difference between a lot of the ones that exist around the world and what we're trying to achieve is having this democratically elected board of representatives and not someone that's appointed. We really want the decisions to be in the hands of the public and for them to be involved in what goes on, because some public utilities around the world do lack that, and they often are swayed by political issues and stuff like that. And so, and we don't want that to happen. So this is what differentiates this bill from a lot of what's happening elsewhere.
There are also a lot of answers in the chat for that question that are coming through. Okay, so I think I'm going to fit in two more questions. One is generally about rural broadband from Roger. If we are going to redo our entire infrastructure, we might as well include broadband. I think that maybe, sorry, Aaron, I know that you talked a lot, but maybe you can answer that one more time.
Sure. So broadband would travel over the same lines. And so it's something that's kind of a no-brainer. It's something that we have as an opt-in possibility within the bills. It's not something that we have initially because unlike with our Public Power New York coalition, where we have a statewide demand from a coalition and from a movement that has been calling for this across the state, we don't want to be speaking for the broadband movement and all across the state. And so we wanted to leave that possibility open and for a campaign to take that up and make it available. But it wasn't something that we felt comfortable speaking for other people to do so. And so it's something we're fully supportive and hope it's a next step along the way.
Yeah. Okay, the last question I'll try to fit in here. Since we are anticipating a move to electricity, what is New York's potential for pumped storage facilities like Blenheim, Gilboa? Does anybody want to take that?
I'm assuming that this is referring to pumping water up for subsequent release to generate hydro at peak times. So yeah, it's a great way to use electricity when demand is low and store that power for times when demand is high. There are problems, of course, with any kind of hydro, but I think New York has a very has the capacity to do that.
Okay, great. So I think that's all for our Q&A. Thanks for everybody who joined us. I'm going to drop our website link one more time. And we also have a form where you can email your reps to generally support public power policy. And the link to that is here. Yeah, so unless anybody else has any last comments, I think that we can wrap it up. Thanks to everybody who came on Friday afternoon.